15 in our course. Wow, it seems almost impossible that we are already here at the end of our semester. And this is the first week where we've been talking a lot about how language emerges in the typically developing child. And now we're going to talk a little bit about things that can go wrong. And I know I've mentioned little bits and pieces as we move forward, but this is just to give you a little bit of a taste of sort of where you're heading, the direction you're going. Now that we've talked about how normal language develops, now we talk about how and what does it look like when things go wrong. Excuse me, it looks like I have a little meeting notice here that popped up. If I can get rid of that. Give me 1 second. Goodness gracious. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so the prevalence, and that means how often it occurs. So there are 10% of our population that is estimated to have a special need, children with special needs. Within of that 10%, 4 to 6 of them have speech and language disorders or delays. So 4 to 6% of the general population is anticipated to have a speech and language delay or disorder. It really varies. You know, you can't look at every elementary school and say, oh, you know, in that elementary school, there will definitely be 6%, and then the next elementary school over, yes, there's definitely going to be 6%. It's going to vary a little bit. It'll vary by geography. It'll vary by low socioeconomic status. It'll vary by gender, race. It really depends on the environment. But as a general rule of thumb, you can say 4 to 6% might be anticipated to have some type of speech and language delay or disorder. So what does the American Speech and Hearing Association say about speech-language impairment? It says that we say speech is impaired in 3 ways. One, that it calls attention to itself. So I notice it. It causes itself to be evident. Okay? Interferes with communication, either with understanding or with the ability to express oneself. And then it causes distress in either the speaker or the listener. So when those things occur, we say that speech is impaired. In the textbook, you'll notice that SLI, the term SLI, refers to specific language impairment. In some states, it's referred to, here in Arizona for one, it's referred to as speech-language impairment. Both are correct, though depending on the state that you work in or the laws that you read, IDEA and state regulations, you may see it called specific language impairment, but both are referring to the same thing. So SLI is the abbreviation for that. ASHA now calls what we used to call phonology disorders, we call it now speech sound disorders. So speech sound disorders are problems with speech sound production. And that can be both articulation, so like a lisp or a distorted R, or it could be the overuse or the extended use of phonological processes. It might be something like apraxia. So there are different types of speech sound disorders that emerge. And we call them in one general lump speech sound disorders. Okay, language impairment refers to either the understanding of language or its use. So either your ability to understand what is being said to you and interpreting and processing and acting on it, or your actual use of language, your use of vocabulary, the word order you use, and the morphology that you use. Voice disorders are abnormalities that are to the vocal folds and the resonance cavities. So voice might be a voice that is too high for the age of the client. That's called puberphonia. It might be vocal abuse. So, singers or teachers, coaches who have an extremely hoarse or vocal quality that's very raspy might be the result of some vocal abuse or damage to the vocal cords. And then fluency affects the rhythm and rate of speech. Some people speak in a very rapid rate that sort of words fall on top of each other, that would be cluttering. And then the more familiar fluency disorder is stuttering, where speech is broken or there are iterations, repetitions of a particular phrase or sentence or word. So what causes SLI? What causes a speech language impairment? And the reality is we don't always know. There might be organic disorders that, like a cleft palate or vocal fold paralysis, that would cause there to be some type of disorder to language. Hearing impairment is its own disorder. So if someone is hearing impaired, it doesn't necessarily cause SLI, but it would cause there to be delays in speech and language. The impairment is hearing impairment. The delays in speech and language are not necessarily SLI, they are delays of language related to the hearing impairment. But it's an organic disorder. In other words, I know where it came from, I know where it started. Functional disorders are the majority of what we deal with especially in the school age population and the young child. We don't know. We don't know what causes children to hang on to phonological processes or to have an expressive language delay. And that's called, so the organic is something that's a known pathology, and then a functional disorder is something we are not aware of what happened. We don't know. The good news is, especially in young children, we don't need to necessarily know in order to treat effectively. So when we talk about speech sound disorders, we typically break them into phonology and articulation errors. So phonology errors is kind of a broad term that describes the bigger picture of speech sounds and speech sound errors. Articulation is more specific in that it talks about a person's ability to not be able to produce a particular sound. So not being able to produce a sound because of, let's say, ankyloglossia, tongue-tied, not being able to say an R correctly, or not being able to produce a particular sound clearly. Phonology is more of that basis of understanding the rules of language. So the speech sound rules, that the processes by which, you have to say all the syllables in a word, or you have to say all the frication in a word. That's more of the phonology-based sound errors. Phonological processes are a type of phonological error. So that would be the ones we talked about previously in brief. Fronting, when we were talking about the building blocks of speech, we talked about phonological processes and how they are typical in young children, and we just expect them to be gone by the age of 4. So fronting, cluster reduction, stopping, final consonant deletion, syllable reduction. Again, we talked about that, I believe it was week 7 or 8. These are all phonological processes. When they become a problem is when they occur greater than 40% of the time past the age of which they should be gone. Other phonological other speech sound disorders in that big term of phonology are lisps, distortion of R's, sound substitution, so saying like tsin for chin or shoes for shoes. Apraxia of speech, also known as verbal apraxia, that can be a type of speech sound disorder. We call those motor speech disorders. Nasal emission or distortion that it occurs from either cleft palate or some other velopharyngeal port insufficiency. So how do we say if language is impaired, delayed, or disordered? An impairment is SLI, speech language impaired, or specific language impairment. It encompasses both a delay and a disorder. A delay implies that language is coming along the same sequence that we would expect language to be acquired, and it just is coming more slowly than would be anticipated. They're just late developing. A disorder is there is something very different about how language is being learned or used, and it's not a typical development sequence. In the state of Arizona, we often call, like I said, SLI is speech language impairment. But again, specific language impairment is equally used and is also correct. There's a wide variety, and they don't all look the same. We say children who are SLI when we do not attribute their delays to deficits in hearing, deficits in oral structure, or deficits in cognition. So in other words, structural differences are not necessarily speech and language impairments. It's the, if you have a cleft palate, okay, that cleft causes sound to resonate through your nose, that might be the cause of why your speech sounds different, and the disability is the cleft palate. SLI is different. SLI is that unique piece that is not attributed to those differences. Same thing with hearing.
This job is so much more fun when they're clumsy.